We are refugees in our own land. Searching for safety. Palestinians know this story. Our grandparents were also refugees. Another strike. 10 more families with nowhere to live. Sometimes we dig out survivors. Sometimes only bodies. We return to search for memories. Fragments of our old lives.
ما في له مأوى نهائي. احنا انا وعيلتي 22 شخص ودار عمي طبعا قاعدين في الشارع. انا قاعد في الشارع انا ومعاي حريم ومعاي اطفال وقاعدين في الشارع. وين نروح؟ ما خلوا مكان مدني الا ضربوه. لا مش عارف والله ما نعرف شو اقول.
It is already hard to remember life before the war. And hard to imagine life after. Our new routine. We back up. We move on.
كم مرة صرتوا نازحين؟
ثالث مرة.
عمرك تروحوا على البيت؟
رفح.
إلك حدا في رفح؟
ورا ولا كيف؟
We hope to return. We fear we won't.
يوم بعتوا أول الأسطوانات صاروا يقولوا الكتيبة.
عمرك تروح على البيت؟
والله ما احنا عارفين نطلع رفح زينا زي هالناس مش عارفين ابراهيم. الله المستعان ان شاء الله. ربنا يفرجها يا حبيبي. سلام ابراهيم اشوفك على خير يا حبيبي.
الله يسلمك.
All we know is we cannot stay here. Rafah, our last stop. The Egyptian border. But we cannot cross.
وهي رابع نزحة أطلع من أنقل حالي. يعني عندك 4 مرات أنا نزحت من يوم الحرب. وطبعا غير الشهداء وغير اللخمات تاعونا والدار طبعا نزلت. المحل تبع فزم وتكاتك برضه نزل عليه خرب بالمرة. يعني طلعنا بواعينا لحتى الآن الحمد لله. فيش عندي بنت مقعدة، عندي بنت بتغسل كلى. فيش من وين الاقي احنا لحتى الان 5 مرات نزحت.
They push us further. Maybe to a new life beyond. Refugees. Once again.
Yousef Hammash. Now, delegates at the UN Security Council will vote later tonight on the ceasefire resolution, but the United States has already said it will not support an immediate truce, saying Hamas has no desire to see a durable peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. But they also warned Israel it must do more to minimise harm to civilians and to avoid further mass displacement of people who fled to southern Gaza. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Secunda Kamani reports.
You wonder what will be left of Gaza by the time this war ends. What future will this little boy and so many other children face? Israel's bombardment of this densely populated territory is one of the heaviest ever witnessed in the world, according to analysts. All those we pulled out from the rubble were civilians, this man in Khan Yunis says. The house was full of children. At the United Nations Security Council today, a vote on calls for a humanitarian ceasefire. The Secretary-General invoking powers not used for the past 50 years to urge action.
There is a high risk of the total collapse of the humanitarian support system in Gaza, which would have devastating consequences. We anticipate that it would result in a complete breakdown of public order and increased pressure for mass displacement into Egypt. I fear the consequences could be devastating for the security of the entire region.
But despite expressing concern over civilian casualties, Israel's staunch ally, the US, opposes the resolution.
While the United States strongly supports a durable peace in which both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security, we do not support calls for an immediate ceasefire. This would only plant the seeds for the next war, because Hamas has no desire to see a durable peace.
The Israeli army is pushing further into Khan Yunis, the latest focus of their offensive. Officials here insist Hamas's brutal attacks on October the 7th mean the group must be eliminated. In northern Gaza, Israel has been detaining large numbers of Palestinian men as they take over more neighborhoods. These images published yesterday provoking outrage. Palestinian families have been identifying some of those pictured, including journalist Dia Al-Khalot. The images of the mass detention of Palestinian men, including apparently journalists, employees of a UN school, to many that exemplifies the harsh collective punishment, the brutal collective punishment being meted out to people in Gaza.
Now, those men we're seeing in those images are military-aged men who were discovered in areas that civilians were supposed to have evacuated weeks ago. We're talking about people who've remained in Hamas strongholds, where we have seen close-quarter fighting between IDF troops and Hamas terrorists who've been ambushing them. And of course, when we find those individuals, suspected terrorists, we have to check, first of all, they don't have explosives on them. Hamas has a penchant for suicide bombings as well. And we have to work out who is a terrorist, who may have useful information, and to the extent that there are people who are not terrorists there, of course, they will be released.
Well, once you've ascertained, for example, that someone hasn't got a suicide vest, doesn't have a weapon on them, why keep them stripped naked? I mean, that appears to be a deliberate attempt at degrading them, at humiliating them.
No, what Israel is doing now is capturing suspected terrorists who've been found in Hamas strongholds, where we've been engaging them in close-quarter combat.
The Israeli military refused to tell us how many men have been detained or where they're being held. Some have been released. The relative of one told us he was kept semi-naked for hours before being freed. Others remain in detention. Will Israel truly ever be able to eliminate Hamas's military capabilities? Today, Hamas released a new video of their stock of rockets. They cause little damage, but it's a reminder decades of conflict are unlikely to end with this war. And for now, the Israeli assault shows no sign of slowing. This is a hospital in Khan Yunis. How many more will die before the bombs stop?
Well, joining me now is the Director of Communications at the UN Relief Agency in Gaza, Tamara Al-Rifai. Earlier today, its chief, Philippe Lazzarini, wrote a strong appeal to the UN, predicting that his staff would be killed and their entire mandate would collapse unless there was a ceasefire. Tamara Al-Rifai, it's an extraordinary letter that your chief has written, but Israel is increasingly seeing you as having taken sides in this. There's an Israeli Knesset member who was just given a speech in the European Parliament calling you accomplices to Palestinian terror.
You're seeking my comment on this?
Yeah. As
a representative of a principled, credible, the largest UN agency in Gaza today, the last lifeline for 2.2 million people in Gaza, the agency that opened its shelters, 156 shelters for 1.2 million Palestinians in Gaza. My response is the response of the Commissioner General of UNRWA and the head of the UN, the Secretary General. We have to be able to do our job. The UN was created to maintain peace and security. The humanitarian and relief arm of the UN was created to be able to respond to wars and natural disasters. What we're seeing today in Gaza is a humanitarian catastrophe of colossal magnitude. We need to be able to work, but sadly, tragically, the space that we have today has shrunk to the maximum with 130 of my own colleagues, UNRWA staff members, who were killed themselves in Gaza. This is my response.
How many more staff colleagues do you have when your chief warns that, you know, they could all effectively be killed?
We have 13,000 staff members in Gaza. These are doctors and paramedics and engineers and teachers and social workers and sanitation workers. They are all Palestinians. They are part of the civilian population that should be protected. Those who were killed alongside the thousands and thousands of Palestinians who were killed. But those who were not killed, believe it or not, are displaced themselves. But while they're displaced in our own shelters, the UNRWA shelters, many of them continue to do the rounds, to offer assistance, to check on the wounded, to check on the sick people, to distribute food. My colleagues continue to distribute wheat flour in shelters and outside. They continue to do the rounds in the shelters to distribute clean drinking water. We're talking about 13,000 people. Around 5,000 of them are still active UNRWA aid workers.
Now, Mr. Lazzarini, and presumably the UN Secretary General as well, know that the United States will block UN Security Council resolutions that demand permanent ceasefire. So the UN institution that could actually have some sort of influence over Israel is not able to function because it will be blocked. Where does that leave your operations and your warning?
It leaves us on the verge of collapse. UNRWA is the largest UN agency currently operating in Gaza, and the whole world is watching whether a neutral, impartial, principled, and credible UN agency will be offered the safe humanitarian space to act. For now, what we are seeing in Gaza is unprecedented. The scale of the destruction and the scale of the human suffering, 1.9 million people of a total population of 2.2 million, that's 85% of the population, is now made displaced. Many of these people displaced for 2 or more times. And as a reminder, many people were pushed by the Israeli authorities to leave the north of the Gaza Strip and go south for safety. They have not been safe.
Tomorrow?
The minute, yes?
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. Thank you.